They say a man shows his true soul when he breaks his last piece of bread in two. On the edge of the Arizona territory, where the wind carried alkali dust across the flats and a cold moon silvered the cactus spines, Elias Boone sat beside a dying campfire with nothing left in this world but one strip of dried venison, half a corn cake, and an old horse too tired to complain. His bedroll was thin, his pockets near empty, and by morning he meant to ride 20 miles west hoping work still existed somewhere beyond the red mesas. But hunger has a sound, and that night he heard it before he saw her. It came like a faint stumble beyond the firelight, the scrape of a boot over stone. Elias reached for no gun. He only looked up. A young Apache woman stood at the edge of the glow, wrapped in dust and moonlight, her dark braid loosened by travel, her face hollow with exhaustion but proud in a way that made a man lower his eyes out of respect. She said nothing. She did not beg. That was what held him. In those days, plenty of people asked for things. Very few carried silence like dignity. Elias studied her for a breath, maybe two. Then, without asking her name, without asking where she came from or who might be following, he broke the corn cake and held out the larger piece. She looked at it, then at him as if measuring whether kindness always came with a hidden price. He nodded once. She stepped closer. Her hands trembled only when she reached for the bread. They ate beside the coals with no more words than the fire made. Somewhere out on the flats a coyote called. A north wind pushed through the sage. Elias could smell wood smoke in her clothes, desert rain in the dust, leather and horse sweat from miles of hard riding. It felt less like meeting a stranger than remembering someone he had not known he had lost. When the venison was gone, she touched the little turquoise beads tied at her wrist, hesitated, then slipped the bracelet free and laid it beside Elias's saddle. He started to protest, but she lifted one hand, gentle as a promise, and touched two fingers first to her own chest, then to his, a gesture old as vows, though Elias did not know it. "Why give me this?" he asked. Her voice came soft, carrying an accent shaped by wind and stone. "Because a man who shares his last meal shares more than food." Before he could answer, she rose. For one impossible moment he thought to ask her to stay by the fire till dawn. But she was already moving back toward darkness. At the edge of the camp glow she turned and looked at him once more, and the look unsettled him more than beauty ever could. Carried certainty. Then she was gone into the sage. Elias stared at the beads long after the fire burned low. He did not know that by sunrise the whole town of Dust Hollow would be whispering his name. He did not know a single act of hunger shared in silence had crossed a boundary older than maps. All he knew was that in 50 hard years no one had ever left him a gift for kindness. And as he closed his eyes beneath the cold stars, his rough hand wrapped unconsciously around those turquoise beads, a strange thought came over him, quiet as desert wind. Some promises are spoken. Others arrive while a man is too poor to know he has just been chosen. Morning came thin and pale over Dust Hollow, spilling gold across warped storefronts, hitching rails, and the powdery street where every boot print held yesterday's memory. Elias Boone rode in slow, his old sorrel gelding favoring one leg, the turquoise bracelet tucked inside his coat pocket where his hand kept drifting without reason. He had slept little. Something in the girl's eyes had stayed with him, the kind of look a man carries into daylight whether he wants to or not. Dust Hollow was already awake. Tin cups clinked inside Martha Flynn's boarding house. Wagons rolled toward the freight road, and the barber out front swept dirt that would return by noon. It was the same town Elias had passed through for 10 years, and yet that morning something felt altered, as if the air itself were listening. Folks nodded to him the way they always did, half respect, half pity for a man who owned little besides honesty. Some called him stubborn. Others called him a fool because he gave away what he could not spare. But no one ever called him cruel. Elias tied his horse and stepped into Martha's place where coffee simmered black as creek mud. Old Martha set down a chipped mug before he asked. "You look haunted," she muttered. Elias almost smiled. "Maybe I met a ghost." She studied him, then noticed the blue beads when he drew them from his pocket. Her weathered face changed. "Where did you get those?" Before he could answer, voices outside shifted. Not louder. Stranger. The kind of hush people make when surprise steals language. Chairs scraped. Men turned toward the doorway. Elias stepped onto the porch and saw them coming up the street. 3 Apache women walked together through drifting dust, their dresses brushed clean, silver pendants catching sunlight. Between the older women moved the girl from the fire, no longer worn down by hunger, but upright, composed, carrying herself with the quiet gravity of someone born to be obeyed by no one and bowed to by none. Naeli. He did not know her name yet, but his heart recognized her before his mind did. Townsfolk gathered in doorways. A ranch hand laughed nervously and stopped when no one joined him. Naeli came to a halt 10 feet from Elias. The wind lifted one loose strand of dark hair across her cheek. She looked first at the bracelet in his hand, then at him. There was no uncertainty in her gaze. One of the elder women said something softly in Apache. Naeli nodded and stepped forward. She raised her hand and rested it over Elias Boone's chest as though feeling whether his heart still kept honest rhythm. Then in clear, measured English she said, "This man fed me as a husband feeds his wife." For a moment even the horses seemed still. A spoon fell somewhere inside the boarding house and clattered like thunder. Elias forgot to breathe. Someone at the far end of the porch whispered, "Did she say husband?" But Naeli did not look at them. Only him. There was no teasing in her voice, no trap, no performance for the town. Only conviction, almost sacred in its calm. Elias searched for words and found none. He had faced drought, debt, blizzards on open range, and once spent 3 days lost in canyon country, but nothing had unsettled him like being looked at, as if he already belonged to something larger than himself. Then she said one more thing, so quiet only he heard it. "You shared your last bread. Among my people, that is not forgotten." And in that instant Elias Boone understood the night before had not ended when the fire died. It had only just begun. No man in Dust Hollow seemed to breathe until old Martha Flynn stepped onto the porch and broke the silence with a dry whisper meant only for herself. "Lord help that boy." But help was the last thing Elias Boone understood he needed. He stood as though the earth beneath his boots had shifted, hearing murmurs gather like wind through cottonwoods. Some faces held amusement, others suspicion, a few something close to awe, yet Naeli seemed untouched by any of it. She looked not at the town, not at the old women beside her, only at Elias as if the judgment that mattered rested in one man's answer. He cleared his throat, but the words came rough. "Ma'am, I think there may be some misunderstanding." A faint smile moved at the edge of her mouth, not offended, almost sad. "There is misunderstanding," she said softly, "but not from me." That unsettled him more than if she had spoken sharply. Sheriff Wade Cutter drifted near, pretending interest in his badge while listening with both ears. Men leaned against hitching posts to catch each word. Dust Hollow had found a story to live on for months. Elias felt their eyes and hated it for her sake. He lowered his voice. "I gave you supper because you were hungry." Naeli nodded. "And because you were hungry too." Her words landed heavier than he expected. He had not thought she noticed he gave her the larger share. He had not thought anyone ever noticed much about him at all. One of the elder women stepped forward carrying a small buckskin pouch. From it she drew a silver pendant shaped like a crescent moon and held it up where morning light flashed blue fire from a turquoise stone. The old woman spoke in Apache, voice low and rhythmic, then paused while Naeli translated. "My mother wore this when she was given bread by my father during famine years. It means food shared in hardship binds honor." A ranch hand near the feed store gave a mocking laugh. "Next thing she will claim a wedding happened by campfire." Some chuckled. Elias stiffened. Naeli turned toward the sound, and though her face stayed calm, her stillness carried more force than anger. "Among my people," she said, "a promise is not smaller because others laugh at it." Even the mocker looked away. Elias felt shame rise, not because of her claim, but because he had almost let ridicule make him step back from simple decency. Martha Flynn moved closer and muttered, "Boy, listen before you answer." Elias did listen. He heard not just words but something older moving beneath them. Code, perhaps. A moral weight frontier men claimed to honor but often forgot when convenient. He looked at the bracelet again. The beads were worn smooth by years of touch. This was no flirtation born at sunrise. It belonged to a lineage of meanings he barely grasped. "Why come here to tell this before everyone?" he asked. Naeli's eyes softened. "Because honor hidden is honor doubted." Then she added, "And because I wished you to choose in daylight what was offered in darkness." The line struck him like a church bell heard from far off. Choose. Not obey. Not submit. Choose. Yet before Elias could answer, a tall figure in a black coat appeared at the edge of the crowd. Silas Hume, cattle broker, land lender, a man whose smile always seemed to count profit. He watched Naeli with a look Elias did not trust. "Well now," Silas drawled, stepping forward. "Either this is romance or trouble wearing beads." The town laughed uneasily, but Elias did not. Something in Silas's tone carried the first scent of storm. And standing there between the woman who had called him husband and the town waiting to turn tenderness into spectacle, Elias Boone felt a hard truth rise in him, quiet but immovable. Some moments ask a man not what he believes, but whether he has the courage to stand beside it. Silas Hume had a way of speaking that made even friendly words feel sharpened. He removed his gloves finger by finger, slow enough for everyone to watch, then let his pale eyes drift from Naeli to Elias and back again as if pricing livestock. "Seems our lonely cowboy has stumbled into foreign customs," he said. A few men chuckled because they feared silence more than cruelty. Elias did not smile. He had known Silas too long. The man lent money in droughts, bought ranches when payments failed, and carried himself as though all things, land, cattle, even dignity, had a market value. "Leave be, Silas," Martha Flynn muttered, but Silas stepped closer. "I only wonder," he said, "whether a meal and a moonlit story make a marriage now." Naeli met his stare with unsettling calm. "No," she answered. "Honor does." The words moved through the gathered townsfolk like a gust before rain. Sheriff Wade shifted uneasily but said nothing. Elias noticed that. He noticed too how Naeli did not shrink under mockery. She stood as though every insult passed through empty air. That steadiness stirred something protective in him he had not invited. Silas circled a little, boots pressing crescent marks in dust. "Tell me, Miss Apache, if he fed you a biscuit and jerky, does that make him husband by your law?" Naeli glanced at Elias before answering, as though the truth belonged partly to him. It was not the food. It was that he had little and shared half. Even some of the harder men grew quiet at that. Frontier folk understood scarcity. They knew what a last meal meant. Yet Silas pressed harder. "And if he refuses this bond?" For the first time a shadow crossed Naeli's face. Not fear but sorrow old as memory. "Then he refuses nothing but my honor returned." The answer unsettled Elias more than accusation ever could have. She had given him a way out without bitterness. That was what made leaving feel smaller. Old Martha leaned near him and whispered, "Boy, watch who carries pride gentle. They are the ones worth trusting." But the town was already shifting into camps. Some muttered that Elias should send the women away before trouble brewed. Others watched with fascination, sensing a tale larger than gossip. A young stable hand asked if Apache customs truly bound a man by bread. One of the elder women answered in measured English, "Not bread. Sacrifice." The word lingered. Sacrifice. Elias rolled it in his mind and remembered nights he had eaten less, so his horse could keep strength, winters when he had gone hungry rather than borrow from men like Silas. He had never called those acts noble, only necessary. Yet in Naeli's world, necessity born for another had sacred weight. Silas must have sensed the town drifting from laughter toward thought, and thought was dangerous to men who thrived on contempt. His tone hardened almost imperceptibly. "Fine words," he said, "but pretty customs do not alter property lines or town law." At that, Naeli's gaze sharpened. "Nor does town law alter truth." A hush followed. Somewhere a screen door creaked in the wind. Elias felt the morning narrowing around a decision not yet spoken. Then Silas stepped too close and with 2 fingers lifted the turquoise bracelet hanging from Elias's hand as though inspecting trinkets at auction. Curious what a man receives for half a biscuit. Elias's jaw set. He did not raise his voice. Take your hand off that. It was the first time many in Dust Hollow had heard iron in Elias Boone. Even Silas paused. Naeli watched him then with something almost unreadable. Not romance, not triumph, but recognition. As if a line invisible till now had been crossed. And in that stillness Elias understood trouble had indeed arrived wearing beads. But not the kind Silas meant. It was the kind that asks whether a man values ridicule more than honor, and whether he can tell the difference before it costs him his soul. Silas Hume let the bracelet fall back into Elias Boone's hand. But he did it with the faint smile of a man who believed every contest could still be turned his way. Touchy over beads, he murmured. That alone tells a story. Then he stepped back and addressed the gathering as though he were suddenly host to a show. Tell me, neighbors, are we to watch Dust Hollow governed now by campfire customs? A few men laughed, though weaker than before. Something had shifted. The mockery no longer sounded sure of itself. Yet ridicule, once stirred, does not settle easy. It spreads. A woman near the mercantile whispered too loudly that Elias had lost his senses over a pretty face. Another muttered that strangers brought curses disguised as sentiment. Old fears, old prejudices crawling out where reason thinned. Elias heard it all. What troubled him most was not insult aimed at him, but the way some looked at Naeli as if she were less a woman than a rumor wearing skin. He felt heat rise in his chest. Naeli seemed to sense it. She turned slightly toward him and in a voice only he could hear said, "Do not spend anger where silence may reveal hearts." Strange counsel in a hostile street, yet it steadied him. One of the elder women opened the buckskin pouch again and drew out a small braided cord threaded with blue stones and a single silver bead darkened by age. She held it toward Elias. "This is given when a man is recognized before witnesses," she said. "Not demanded, offered." Elias did not take it. Not from refusal, but from awe. Such trust frightened a poor man more than threats ever had. Then Silas laughed softly. "Fine ceremony. But if our cowboy here is now bound by tribal vows, perhaps his debts transfer too." There it was. The real scent beneath the smoke. Money, land, control. Elias remembered the note due next month on his worn-down parcel outside town. Land Silas had long wanted. Suddenly this spectacle wore a second face. Silas was not mocking romance. He was probing weakness. Martha Flynn caught it too. "You snake!" she hissed under her breath. But before she could say more, a young drifter in the crowd called out, "Ask her what she expects from him." Murmurs rose. The question hung ugly in the air. Naeli faced them all. "Nothing." She paused, then added, "Except that truth not be hidden because others fear it." Her calm shamed the street more than rebuke could have. Even Sheriff Wade finally spoke, hesitant but sincere. "Seems the lady has shown more dignity than most this morning." That drew sideways looks. For a sheriff known for caution, it was near courage. Silas's eyes narrowed. He sensed ground slipping. "Dignity is cheap," he said. "A ranch survives on hard facts." Elias turned then, slowly, and for the first time addressed not Naeli, not Martha, but the town itself. "Hard fact is this," he said. "A hungry traveler came to my fire. I shared what I had. If any man here thinks kindness is shame, he ought examine his own table." No one answered. A wagon will creak somewhere down the road. Dust curled along the boardwalk. And in that pause Naeli reached forward and gently placed the braided cord into Elias's open palm. Her fingers brushed his weathered hand, no more than a breath of contact. Yet something in that simple touch carried the gravity of covenant. Silas saw it and stepped in too quickly, meaning perhaps to snatch the cord or break the moment with scorn. But Elias moved first, not with fury, only certainty, closing his hand around the beads and saying low enough to chill the space between them, "That stays with me." It was a small act, No drawn weapon. No shouted threat. Yet everyone felt it. A line had become a stand. And though Elias did not yet know how dear that stand might cost, he sensed the story had ceased being about a misunderstanding in the street. It had become a trial of character, and trials out in the West had a way of revealing who owned land and who possessed honor. The braided cord rested in Elias Boone's palm with a weight no silver coin had ever carried. He could feel each worn bead press against his skin as though touched by generations before him. Around the porch, Dust Hollow lingered in uneasy stillness, but the spectacle had begun to thin. Some drifted back toward wagons and storefronts, though slowly, unwilling to miss what might come next. Silas Hume stood apart now, watching with the patient look of a man postponing a move rather than abandoning it. Elias knew that look. It belonged to men who smiled before collecting debts. But for the moment even Silas had lost command of the crowd. Nayeli turned to the elder women and spoke in Apache, her voice low as wind through mesquite. One of them nodded and stepped forward again. "There is something he should know," she said, glancing at Elias. "Not before all." Then she motioned toward the shade beside Martha Flynn's porch. After a hesitation, Elias followed. Nayeli came with them, and for the first time the town's noise receded enough that he heard only the creak of the sign overhead and the restless flick of his horse's tail at the hitch rail. In that little pocket of shade, the older woman opened her palm and revealed a small turquoise stone wrapped in faded silver wire, old enough the metal had softened with wear. "This belonged to Nayeli's mother," she said. "She gave it to a man once who shared food in winter scarcity. That man later crossed mountains to protect her people during fever years." Elias studied the stone. It looked humble, almost plain, but the story inside it stirred something deep. "Why tell me this?" he asked. Nayeli answered herself. "Because you think I came to claim a husband. I came to honor a man who acted as one before knowing the word." Elias looked at her long. There was no coquetry in her, no manipulation, only a strange, unguarded truth that made falsehood feel cheap. "In my world," he said slowly, "marriage is spoken before a preacher." Nayeli nodded. "In mine, it begins when someone shares life where loss is near." Her words held no challenge, only difference. That made them harder to dismiss. Old Martha, who had followed closer than invited, folded her arms and muttered, "I have lived 70 years and heard worse definitions." Even Elias laughed softly at that. It eased something tight in him, yet unease remained. "You do not know me," he said to Nayeli. "You know one night." She met that without blinking. One night shows what 10 years of talk can hide. He had no answer ready for such a line. The elder woman then placed the old turquoise stone in Elias's hand beside the braided cord. "These are not chains," she said. "They are memory. Keep them only if you understand their burden." Burden. The word settled deep. For a poor cowboy used to owning little, being trusted with symbolic weight felt almost more frightening than losing land. Across the street Silas called something to a rancher and laughed too loudly. Elias glanced over and caught him staring. Trouble had not gone. It had only stepped back to gather shape. Nayeli noticed where his eyes moved. "He fears what he cannot buy," she said. Elias almost asked how she knew men like Silas so well, but something in her expression hinted at histories yet untold. Then she reached and adjusted the braided cord in his hand so the silver bead rested on top. "This bead," she whispered, "marks a vow tested." "Tested by what?" Elias asked. She looked toward the dusty road leading out to the red hills. "By whether a man protects honor when ridicule turns costly." Her words lingered after she stepped back. And in that quiet shade, with town noise drifting like distant cattle bells and turquoise warming in his palm, Elias Boone felt a truth both troubling and beautiful. Sometimes the greatest thing ever placed in a man's hands looks no larger than a bead, yet weighs enough to alter the road beneath his feet. By noon the sun stood white over Dust Hollow, flattening shadows and drawing heat from the plank road until the whole town seemed to shimmer. Yet under that hard light, tension only sharpened. Elias Boone had not moved far from Martha Flynn's porch, The braided cord looped now around his wrist beneath his cuff, hidden but felt. A man can forget a borrowed coin in his pocket. He does not forget a promise against his skin. Across the street Silas Hume leaned near the water trough, speaking low with two ranch hands known more for loud opinions than hard thinking. Elias could not hear the words, but he saw heads turn toward Naeli and knew enough. Poison rarely entered a town by shout, came by whisper. Naeli stood near the hitch rail, stroking Elias's old horse along the neck, speaking to the animal in Apache. The gelding, suspicious of most strangers, lowered its head as if listening. Elias watched that and wondered what else trusted her without effort. Then the first stone of trouble rolled. One ranch hand, broad-shouldered and eager for Silas's approval, sauntered forward and pointed at the braided cord half visible near Elias's wrist. "Pretty decoration for a cattleman," he said. Laughter fluttered from those who feared being singled out. Elias ignored him, but the man took one step nearer Naeli. "Tell us, does your tribe hand out husbands with every meal?" It was crude, and even some in the crowd flinched. Naeli answered nothing. She only lifted her chin and looked at him with a silence that made his grin falter. Yet he reached, perhaps meaning mockingly, to touch the turquoise cord. Before his fingers met it, Elias stepped between them. No rush, no threat, simply there. His voice came low, almost weary. "That is enough." The ranch hand scoffed. "You defending superstition now?" Elias held his gaze. "I am defending respect." For words, quiet as dust, but they carried. Even Sheriff Wade straightened. Silas called from the trough, feigning amusement. "Seems Boone has gone sentimental." Elias did not look toward him. He bent instead, for in the shuffle the old turquoise stone Naeli's elder had shown him had slipped and fallen into the dirt. He picked it up carefully, brushed away dust with his thumb, then turned to Naeli and placed it back in her open palm as though returning a relic to an altar. The whole street watched. Something changed in that gesture. Men who might have laughed an hour before now saw not romance but reverence. Naeli closed her fingers over the stone and whispered, "You have chosen once." Elias frowned. "Chosen what?" "To stand before understanding." The words unsettled him because they were true. He had not solved the meaning of any of this. He had merely refused humiliation in front of him. Yet perhaps that was where honor always began. Silas, sensing the crowd drifting from mockery toward admiration, made his boldest move. He strode forward and said loud enough for all, "Careful, Boone. Defend a stranger too hard and folks may think your loyalties moved beyond town law." The implication hung dark. Some looked uneasy. It was the oldest frontier trick, paint decency as betrayal. Elias turned then, finally meeting Silas eye to eye. A man's loyalty is not measured by whom he despises. Even Martha let out a breath at that. Silas had no quick answer. For a blink, his polished confidence slipped. And in that small fracture, the town saw what Naeli perhaps had seen long before. One man traded in fear, another in principle. The wind pushed through the street carrying dry sage and wagon grease. Somewhere a church bell rang the hour. Naeli looked toward the red hills as if listening to something beyond hearing. Then she said softly, almost to herself, "Now the real test comes." Elias followed her gaze to the road beyond town, where distant riders moved like dark marks in heat shimmer. Too far yet to know who. Close enough to know the day had not finished revealing its judgment. The riders came slow, not in the hard posture of men arriving for conflict, but with the grave deliberation of those carrying meaning. For figures emerged from the heat shimmer, horses moving in quiet cadence, their shadows stretching thin across the road. Dust Hollow watched as though a storm had taken human form. Even Silas Hume stepped back a half-pace. The lead rider was older, broad-shouldered despite years, his hair braided with silver threads and eagle feathers dulled by age. He sat his horse with the calm of a man who had never hurried to prove authority. Naeli lowered her eyes briefly in respect. "Chief Takota," she said. The name moved through the town like a rumor turning real. Some expected confrontation. Others expected demands. But the old chief dismounted without flourish, handed his reins to a younger rider, and walked forward carrying nothing but a carved walking stick polished by long use. He stopped before Elias Boone and studied him for a long moment that felt less like judgment than measurement. Then he spoke in careful English. "You are the one who fed my daughter when your own fire was small." Daughter. The word struck Elias first. He glanced at Naeli, who gave the slightest nod. He had thought perhaps niece, ward, something less direct. Yet here stood a chief calling her daughter before the whole town. Elias removed his hat. "I gave what I had." Dakota inclined his head. "That is why I came." A murmur passed through the crowd. This was not the script Fear had written. Silas recovered first. "If you have claims upon this man," he said, trying for authority, "they ought be stated plain." The chief turned to him, not offended, almost pitying. "Claims?" He let the word rest a moment. "Honor does not make claims. It recognizes them." Even Sheriff Wade looked ashamed at how much dignity sat in so few words. Dakota lifted the carved stick and traced a small circle in the dust at his feet. "In our law," he said, "food shared in hunger may mark a bond, but a bond offered can be refused." At that, several townsfolk leaned in. Elias felt his chest tighten. Refused. There it was, the freedom hidden inside obligation. Dakota looked directly at him. "If you reject my daughter's honoring of you, we leave now. No grievance. No burden." He paused, then added, "Respect that asks by force is counterfeit." The whole street fell silent. What many had expected to be tribal pressure revealed itself as something nobler than the town's own gossip. Elias sensed minds changing around him. He also sensed Silas growing smaller beneath it. But the old chief was not finished. He gestured toward the gathered townsfolk. "Some here laugh because they think my daughter came to bind a white man by custom. No, she came because she feared silence might let kindness be forgotten." Then he said something that seemed aimed not at Elias but at every soul listening. "Civilization is not proved by whose skin is pale, but by who keeps honor when no witness compels it." No one answered. Even Silas had no sneer ready. Martha Flynn removed her spectacles and wiped her eyes, though no one remarked on it. Elias looked from Dakota to Naeli. She stood without pleading, as willing to be refused as to be received. That freedom moved him more than any pressure could have. Then Dakota reached into his coat and drew out a small silver ring set with a rough turquoise chip. He held it out not as command but invitation. "My wife wore this before she died. I offer it only as symbol. Nothing more." Elias did not yet take it. His hand hovered uncertain. For in that moment he saw the true reversal of the day. The people who had called themselves civilized had mocked what they did not understand. Those they feared had come bearing consent, humility, and grace. And standing in that noon silence, with a ring glinting in an old chief's palm and Naeli waiting without demand, Elias Boone realized the choice before him was no longer whether to avoid scandal. It was whether he possessed enough courage to receive honor as humbly as he had once given bread. For a long moment Elias Boone did not move. The silver ring rested in Chief Dakota's weathered palm, catching the noon light the way still water catches sky. Around him the town had gone so quiet a man could hear harness leather creak and wind move through the telegraph wires. Even Dust Hollow seemed to know some things ought not be rushed. Elias looked first at the ring, then at Naeli. She stood as she had stood from the beginning, not asking, not pleading, carrying dignity so naturally it made many forms of pride seem cheap beside it. He thought of the night before, of breaking the last corn cake in two beside a dying fire, never imagining a gesture born of ordinary mercy could return clothed in honor. He thought of the turquoise beads warming in his pocket, of old Martha's warning, of Silas's laughter already turning thin. And he understood something men often learn too late. What changes a life rarely arrives looking grand. It arrives looking small enough to overlook. Elias removed his hat and held it against his chest. His voice, when it came, was rough with feeling but steady. "A man does not earn a word like husband in one night." He paused, and no one stirred. Then he looked at Naeli and continued, But if that word means sharing bread when there is little, standing beside another when others mock, and keeping honor when walking away would be easier, then I would be ashamed to refuse it. A breath seemed to leave the street all at once. Old Martha covered her mouth. Sheriff Wade lowered his eyes as if witnessing prayer. Silas Hume stared as though some calculation had failed him. Elias reached out and closed Chief Tekota's fingers gently back over the ring. For an instant the town thought he had declined. But Elias smiled faintly and said, "A gift that belonged to your wife ought stay with your people." Then he lifted the braided cord from his wrist, threaded the silver ring upon it himself, and tied it back in place. "This way," he said. "It rides with both histories." The old chief's eyes shone though his face barely changed. "You speak as one older than your years," he murmured. Naeli stepped closer then. Close enough Elias could see gold flecks in her dark eyes he had not noticed by firelight. She touched the braided cord at his wrist, then rested her hand there a moment. No spectacle, no kiss for a crowd. Only that quiet contact, stronger for what it did not perform. "Now you understand," she whispered. Elias answered, almost smiling, "I am beginning to." The townsfolk watched as Chief Tekota turned to leave, but before mounting he faced the crowd and said one last thing. "Today a poor cowboy gave us a richer lesson than many treaties." No one laughed. Even those who had mocked stood altered in some inward place. Silas stepped forward as if to say something, perhaps reclaim ground, perhaps wound with one final barb. But he stopped when Elias looked at him, not hard, simply clear. Some men are answered by being opposed, others by being outgrown. Silas lowered his gaze first, and that was the quietest reversal of all. By late afternoon the sun softened over Dust Hollow. Naeli walked with Elias to the edge of town where his old horse waited. Neither hurried to name what came next. The road west lay open in red dust and long light. "Will you ride with me?" Elias asked. Naeli looked toward the mesas, then back to him. "For a while," she said, and in those 3 words was more promise than many vows. They mounted and rode out side by side, not fleeing the town, not conquering it, simply leaving it gentler than they had found it. Some said afterward the cowboy married an Apache woman by frontier custom. Others said he merely learned honor wears many languages. Old Martha, when asked, would only stare toward the western road and say, "He shared his last meal and came home with a future." Years later folks still told how no gun was drawn that day, no blood spilled, no hero crowned. Only a hungry man chose not to be smaller than his kindness. And out where wind moves through dry grass and justice often arrives without sound, that was miracle enough.